Welcome everybody, welcome to the LSE for this evening's hybrid event hosted by the LSE's Law School and the LSE's European Institute. My name's Simon Glendinning and I'm head of the European Institute and also Professor in European Philosophy. And I'm really delighted to chair this event tonight and to do so on behalf of both the Law School and the European Institute, and to introduce you to our wonderful panel, Professor Gurminder Bhambra, Hans Kundnani, Professor Helen Thompson, and my LSE colleague, Professor Mike Wilkinson, who told me that we met in a pub many years ago, which I certainly don't remember.
Nor do I.
No, you did, because you told me about it. It was obviously a better evening for me. This event is organised to mark the launch of Hans's book, Eurowhiteness, Culture, Empire and Race in the European Project. And for anyone here interested in purchasing a copy, which I'm sure you will after this event, the book stall is set up outside the theatre, where Hans will also be signing after this event, where there will also be a reception to which you'll be welcome to join us. Now this book, Eurowhiteness, in my view, it really is quite a game changer. We're quite familiar with books that get advertised as saying, you know, the untold story of something, something, something. And I think this book really attempts something just like that. It's, I think, the first book seriously to explore the racial and ethnic motivations internal to the processes of European integration and the formation of the European Union. Now that really is a sort of entry point into thinking about that historical development, particularly after the Second World War, that is an untold story, because there's another story which the EU will tell about itself, and indeed which many academics who work on Europe will repeat faithfully, which is that the European Union, rather than an expression of some problematic racial and ethnic motivations, is the expression of cosmopolitanism, almost the exact opposite. I can see some of my own students today, and I'm going to read out a passage from Immanuel Kant that I read in the class this morning, because it is a summary of that cosmopolitan vision. Now, the quote that I'm going to give you here is also on the European Union website. So that, as it were, Kantian affirmation of a cosmopolitan motivation in terms of the European Union is embraced by the Union itself. But funnily enough, they cut out the last sentence. The European Union will have cut out the last sentence. Extremely important to Hans' argument. So this is Kant talking about what happens in Europe when there's basically war going on all the time, which there was. And he's talking about these countries so closely linked by trade that when there's an upheaval in one or other state because of war, it affects everybody. And this, he says, indirectly prepares the way for a great political body of the future without precedent in the past. Although this political body exists for the present only in the roughest of outlines, it nonetheless seems as if a feeling is beginning to stir in all its members, in all the European nation states, each of which has an interest in maintaining the whole. That's the bit that's cited in the website of the European Union. Something's going on, processes in Europe which are going to bring about the emergence of this great new political body without precedence in the past, a supranational union of states, a federation. And Kant goes on, not quoted in the European Union website, and this encourages the hope that after many revolutions, with all their transforming effects, the highest purpose of nature, a universal cosmopolitan existence, will at last be realised as the matrix within which all the capacities of the human race may develop. So a cosmopolitan end of this historical process which sort of has its first moments in Europe. That last sentence omitted on the EU website, and in a way this makes Hans's point in his book very well. The aim, yes, of the Union is to live with neighbours who are friends rather than enemies, where war is less rather than more likely. That's its real goal. But it is also, and first, an expression of European regionalism, not global cosmopolitanism. The latter would, as it were, come out of this at some later stage. And we might begin to wonder, in the formation of the European Union, is that cosmopolitan end some universality, a human universality at the end of these processes? Is it simply a myth? Well, it's certainly a myth that Europe has internalized as belonging to its own development, even if the actual development of its history is a European regionalism, just as Kant says, it's going to happen first in Europe. And it's a European regionalism in its ethnic and cultural inflection, a regionalism that one might want to oppose to a nascently cosmopolitan Europe, that Kundnani calls Eurowhiteness. And it's Eurowhiteness that he wants to suggest is the real motivation of this European regionalism, which Kant says has a cosmopolitan hope inside itself, but as it were, on its own, it certainly doesn't fulfill. Now, Eurowhiteness, this title, Kundnani takes from a text by Hungarian-American sociologist Josef Boritz. It's almost a laundry metaphor, I think, Eurowhite, because Eurowhiteness contrasts with dirty white, which is a condition of a white majority countries who want to be in the EU. And that would be particularly in recent times Central and Eastern European countries. They'd be dirty white and they have to clean up to become Euro white if they're to become members of the Union. Euro white is, Kundnani then stresses, related to the concept of whiteness but cannot be simply reduced to it, which is a really interesting second contrast. So you've got a contrast between dirty white and Euro white, which is the laundry metaphor, as it were, but then also a relationship between whiteness, Euro whiteness, and whiteness, ethnic identity. And so the question is, and perhaps the question we'll be pursuing here tonight, or one question we'll be pursuing here tonight is, can Euro whiteness maintain a relation to the cosmopolitan hope, or the cosmopolitan horizon, that would offer the possibility of a transcendence of whiteness, which it can't be reduced to, the promise of escaping whiteness through Euro whiteness? Or is it ultimately trapped in that space? Well, to discuss this and other questions, we have our guest tonight, starting second after Hans, Gurminder Bhambra, Professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial Studies in the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. Hans Kundnani, here on my immediate left, an Associate Fellow and former Europe Programme Director at Chatham House, and the author, of course, of Eurowhiteness, as well as a number of other books. Then next in line, third along there, Helen Thompson, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Cambridge. And then at the end, Mike Wilkinson, Professor of Law at LSE. Let's get going then. Well, the format of this event will be, having me now finished, Hans will have an opportunity to present his argument to you, and then the other three will have an opportunity to critically engage with those ideas and their take on the book. And then there'll be a short right of reply for Hans at the end of that, and then an opportunity for a Q&A with you, and also for the people who are joining us in a hybrid form, that there's a PhD student keeping a monitoring of somewhere so that I know where it is. There. Okay, so on we go. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, much, Simon, for that really kind introduction and for those really interesting remarks, which I'm still processing myself. And thank you so much for hosting this event, Mike, as well. Thank you for coming, and to those of you who are watching online. So what I'm going to try to do in 10 minutes or so is give a sort of gist of the argument. I'm going to kind of whiz through it a little bit. And I will try to be brief because I'm lucky to have such a fantastic panel and I really want to hear from them. So Simon, do cut me off if I go on for more than 10 minutes. So Simon, you've already given a little bit of an introduction to the book. Another way of thinking, I suppose, about what it tries to do is what it is it's about ideas of Europe through history. And in particular where the European Union fits into that longer history of ideas of Europe. And in particular, what I try to do in the book is I try to distinguish between two kinds of ideas of Europe. On the one hand, ethnic cultural ideas of Europe, and on the other hand, civic ideas of Europe. And in doing so, I'm using a distinction that comes from the study of nationalism, in particular from Hans Kundnani, who wrote this book in 1944, The Idea of Nationalism, who distinguishes between civic and an ethnic nationalism. And I argue that we can think of European identity and the EU in a somewhat analogous way to nationalism, as Simon has already suggested, as what I call regionalism, which is not the opposite of nationalism, as a lot of people, a lot of pro-Europeans, especially I think in Germany, want to think of the EU as being. But it's actually, as I say, rather analogous to nationalism, except on a larger continental scale. So, you know, Benedict Anderson famously calls nations imagined communities. I think we can think of Europe as being an imagined community as well. And just as you have in the history of nationalisms, this kind of complex interaction between a civic nationalism on the one hand, or a civic element of nationalism on the one hand, and an ethnic or cultural element on the other hand, so I think in the long history of ideas of Europe, you have those two elements as well. And really what I try to show in the book is how the two of them interact, and in particular how the ethnic cultural elements don't just disappear after 1945, but they persist and they influence the European project itself. So the story I tell really begins in classical antiquity, when the idea of Europe as a space first emerges, but it's really in the medieval period that you get the first kind of version of European identity, in other words, Europeanness, as opposed to a space called Europe. And during the medieval period, what it means to be European is fairly straightforwardly synonymous with being Christian. And the embodiment of that idea of Europe, that medieval idea of Europe that's synonymous with Christianity, is Charlemagne, who then becomes, in the post-1945 period, this iconic, inspirational figure for the European Union, which I think already shows you some of the kind of continuities, going all the way from the medieval period through to the post-1945 period. And then in the modern period, you get this new, much more complex idea of Europeanness, which emerges in the context of the European Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. And so it's a kind of secular, rationalist idea of Europe as opposed to the religious idea that you have in the medieval period. But it also emerges in the context of the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia, and in particular the Americas. In other words, the context in which the idea of whiteness emerges as well. So as well as being a rationalist idea of Europe, it's also a racialized idea of Europe and Europeanness. And so the question then becomes, and this is really the question that the book tries to answer, is what then happens after 1945? Pro-Europeans like to think that a completely new idea of Europe emerges after 1945. 1945 as a kind of hour zero. And that this new idea of Europe is a purely civic one that has nothing to do with these older ethnic cultural ideas of Europe. Even though, as the example of Charlemagne already illustrates, they constantly draw on this older history and these older ideas of Europe. The real history of the European Union, and Simon has already sort of indicated this, that there's a certain kind of myth that gets created by the European Union itself about its own history, but the real history is a lot messier than pro-Europeans often want to suggest. In particular, they want to think of the EU, European integration, as a post-colonial project. But actually, that's just historically wrong. It's not just that the early phase of European integration intersects with the end of European colonialism, but the part of the point of European integration in the 1950s was for France and Belgium to consolidate, to integrate, if you like, their remaining colonies in West and Central Africa at a time when they were no longer able to maintain them on their own. There's a fantastic book on this, the definitive book on this, called Eurafrica by Pio Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, which is part of a series that Gurminder edited, I think. And that book came out a decade ago. It's still, I think, remarkably little known outside of academia. But as I say, it tells you this story of how part of the point of European integration in the 1950s was to consolidate those colonies. I call this the original sin of European integration, you know, consciously analogizing to the role of slavery in the history of the United States. Pretty soon after the Treaty of Rome is signed in 1957, which includes these Belgian and French colonies in West and Central Africa, those colonies become independent, roughly around 1960. So that's the end of the EU as a colonial project. There's an open question, which we may get into in the discussion, about whether there are neo-colonial elements in what becomes the European Union. But I do think that then a new, more civic regionalism emerges in the context of what becomes the EU, centred in particular on these ideas of the social market economy and the welfare state and the depoliticised mode of governance that is produced by European integration. I think Mike might say more about that particular aspect, the depoliticised mode of governance, in his remarks. But what then happens is that this history of European colonialism and the role of the early phase of the European project in it gets completely forgotten, even as the Holocaust starts to become an increasingly central collective memory for the EU. And so the way I describe this in the book is that the EU and the narrative that the EU tells about itself is based on what I call the internal lessons of European history. In other words, the centuries of conflict culminating in World War II and the Holocaust, what Europeans did to each other, but not on the external lessons of European history. In other words, what Europeans did to the rest of the world, in particular European colonialism. And I think there's actually something structural going on here. There's a structural reason why that happens, which is that European integration encourages European countries to think about their histories in terms of their relations with each other. As I say, this history of conflict culminating in World War II and the Holocaust, rather than in terms of their interactions with the rest of the world. So in other words, the history of Europe is a kind of a closed system. So this is why I argue that there's a way in which the EU is a kind of a vehicle for imperial amnesia. The next phase of European integration that I then describe is what happens after the end of the Cold War, the sort of 20-year period after the end of the Cold War, when the EU is in this kind of expansive, optimistic mode as it enlarges to include Central and Eastern European countries. And pro-Europeans start to imagine that they can almost remake the whole world in the image of the EU. And this is precisely the period in which this idea of the EU as a cosmopolitan project really starts to take off. So it's kind of a very hubristic moment in the European project. There are, I think, two problems with it. The first is that you get this revival of the idea of a European civilizing mission. That's not a concept that I've used so far, but it's one of, really the continuities, I think, in this long history of ideas of Europe, is this idea of a civilizing mission. And I think what happens, obviously that you have that in the context of European colonialism, and I think what happens in the post-Cold War period is that you have a new version of that, a sort of postmodern, technocratic version of a civilizing mission. Jan Zielonka has written persuasively, I think, about this. And there's also even the idea of sort of civilizing international politics itself. You start to get these ideas of Europe as a civilian power, as a normative power, and sort of transforming and civilizing international politics itself. The second problem is that even as the EU, what becomes the EU, enlarges to include Central and Eastern European countries, its borders to the south remain very hard. Its borders to the east become quite porous and soft, but its borders to the south remain hard. One example of this is that Morocco applies to join the European communities in 1987 and is just told flatly, you can't join because you're not a European country. And so I think what happens is that paradoxically, actually, the enlargement of the EU to include Central and Eastern European countries strengthens this idea that it's a white bloc. That expansive, optimistic, hubristic period in the European project, I think, comes to an end quite suddenly with the beginning of the Euro crisis in 2010. And so the last part of the story, the final chapter, as it were, of the story I tell is about what's happened in the sort of 13 years since the beginning of the Euro crisis in 2010. And I think what happened was, beginning with the Euro crisis and then the series of other crises that hit the EU, the EU went into a kind of a much more sort of defensive mode. Having been in this outward, expansive mode for 20 years after the end of the Cold War, it goes into a much more defensive mode, and it starts to see itself as being surrounded by threats. But then the second really critical juncture, which I think we can see now in retrospect, was the refugee crisis in 2015. And what I think starts to happen after that is the pro-Europeans in the EU start to interpret these threats in civilizational terms. This is against the background of the rise of the far right across Europe and the way that the centre-right is increasingly mimicking the rhetoric and the policies of the far right, especially on these questions around identity and immigration and Islam. Migration policy, refugee policy is obviously where you can really see this happening the most clearly. But I think you also start to get in European foreign policy debates this kind of civilizational thinking. In other words, the idea that international politics is a clash of civilizations, and Europe is a distinct civilization that has to defend itself. And so I think in this context, and this is where I'll end, it seems to me that the ethnic cultural element of European regionalism, that, as I say, has this long history going back to the medieval period, rather than getting weaker, it seems now actually to be getting stronger. And it's these ethnic cultural ideas of European regionalism connected to Christianity and whiteness, but in the context of the European Union, that I call Eurowhiteness.
So, thank you so much for inviting me to comment on the book, and that means also to read the book. I very much enjoyed reading Eurowhiteness, and I thought that Hans really captured some of the key tensions that exist within the EU project, both through its sort of emergence and through its development over the last few decades. And I think that, particularly in terms of the sort of subtitle, Culture, Empire and Race, these are the things that Hans captures incredibly well in terms of this history. And these are themes that are often not discussed as well within sort of European studies or then studies of the European Union. And I think it's perhaps particularly important that he has written about them, because hopefully that will mean that they'll be talked about and discussed in fora where usually academic work is slightly harder to make an entry. And so I think it's really important for who you are as well as what you have written in terms of the importance of the themes that do need to be discussed beyond the university and the academic space. One of the key issues that Hans sets out is this need to distinguish between myth and history when we discuss both the EU and Europe more broadly. And I think that's captured incredibly nicely in the term around cosmopolitan Europe. So this has come a defining conceptual term to how we might think about Europe and the EU. And yet, if you counterpose the term cosmopolitan to multicultural and think to what extent does cosmopolitan carry or convey the idea of Europe also as a multicultural project, we can begin to see what is erased from understandings of the EU that are simply framed in terms of cosmopolitanism, which has no sense of the colonial histories that make up Europe, or then the multicultural societies that now constitute it as a consequence of those colonial histories. And so, in a sense, what I take from Hans's engagement is to think more deeply about how we got here. And for Hans, a lot of that is around terms of regionalism and specifically around issues of race, given the title Eurowhiteness. And I think that's one aspect that I'd like to push back against a little bit, because I think that the colonial histories that come to constitute Europe are not only about race, they're also about race, but actually they're much broader than that. And I think that whilst Hans does mention the colonial histories that make up Europe, I think the failure to take account of those colonial histories in the very construction of Europe is also, is also needed to push the argument further. I mean, one of the things that we can see in Pio, who you've already mentioned, he set out 2 decades ago that what scholarship on the historical evolution of European identity tends to do is tell a very simple and encouraging story. And it's one of rivalries among European countries, it's about the role of the US in post-war reconstruction, and it's then about the bipolar division of the world as embodied within the Cold War. Out of this, Europe is seen to have become an expression of peaceful integration and a demonstration about how a past of conflict and inequality can be overcome. For this, it even won the Nobel Peace Prize. What is omitted, however, in this lovely story is the dismantling of another world order, a world order which had been structured on European colonialism and the ongoing conflicts in which Europe and the EU remained embroiled even during the decades of peace. And Hans mentions this as well within the book, but one of the things, and I think this is an incredibly important thing for us to think about, and that is the fact that victory in Europe after the Second World War and its commemoration on the 8th of May 1945, which saw the liberation of occupied France and the defeat of Nazi Germany. This is the exact same day on which Charles de Gaulle orders French troops to begin a massacre of Algerians who are demonstrating for their own liberation from French colonial rule, leading to the death of anything between 20 to 40,000 Algerians. So on the one hand, we celebrate liberation of occupied France and Nazi Germany, and on the other hand, you have Charles de Gaulle on the very same day ordering the massacres in Algeria. Now, the Algerian War for Independence from France overlapped with the emergence of the European Economic Community, within which Algeria was a subordinate member for the first few years. And so the war of liberation from France was actually also a war of liberation from the European community. These are not isolated incidents. They're accompanied by French atrocities in Indochina across the period, as well as British massacres in the Malayan Emergency and complicity in the war in Korea and elsewhere. The one difference with the war in Algeria is that that war was fought within the territory of the European community, and yet it's still not reckoned with in the promotion otherwise of Europe as a continent of peace in the decades after the end of the Second World War. So the idea that Europe should or could be a model for the world, I think, is dismantled quite effectively by Hans's arguments. And whilst he discusses these in the context of regionalism, as I mentioned earlier, I would emphasise in particular this need for this focus on Europe's colonial histories.
Wow.
Positive sign, I guess. And the, that isn't the timing, is it? Okay. I'll just check. So to emphasise the importance of the ways in which colonial histories have structured the ongoing project of Europe, one thing I'd want to mention just briefly in the context of sort of political debates that are happening at the moment, to the extent that Europe comes to be seen simply as a cultural project, and an idea that what it is something that develops internal to itself, that is, as a consequence of the gifts and talents, etc., and the labour and taxes of the people who live within Europe, absolutely misunderstands the extent to which Europe's wealth has been made on the basis of colonial extraction, generally, collectively, and cumulatively. And there's a lot of work, or increasing amounts of work, that look at the ways that it's the colonial patrimonies that come into Europe that end up funding what are seen to be otherwise national welfare projects within Europe. So when you have politicians within Europe decrying the entry of refugees and migrants and asylum seekers into Europe because they're going to dilute the solidarity that's necessary for the welfare state, what they fail to acknowledge and understand is that the very wealth that enables the welfare state to have been established in the first place comes from those very same colonies. And so in that sense, I think the colonial histories and an emphasis on colonial histories and the extent to which they're significant in the making of Europe is really important. And this is particularly so in a period of increasing authoritarianism across Europe. And so I think I worry about the effectiveness of arguments centred so primarily on race. And my main question to Hans would be around this. The arguments across the chapters are very nicely built, and the argument develops a sense of how we got here. It ends with a chapter on Brexit and imperial amnesia, and I guess I'm a little bit puzzled with that as well, because there's a hope at the end of the book that by leaving Europe, the UK could become less Eurocentric. And now, even if that was possible, and personally I have to say I'm not holding my breath, there is another side to this, because what are the implications of Brexit for Europe, accounting for its own colonial histories? And more broadly, perhaps, having built up this argument about Eurowhiteness, what is its implication for Europe, with or without Britain? I mean, in both continental Europe and in Britain alike, far-right ideas of replacement theory are becoming normalised. Indeed, our own Home Secretary endorsed such ideas just last week in her speech, and her speech this afternoon, if any of you heard, was absolutely full-on, or another F word. But Europe may promote itself as a safe landing from empire. This is something that Timothy Snyder has argued, and Hans also discusses in his book. But this is only ever a safe landing from empires that existed on European soil. It won't escape notice that it provides no landing for those who are frequently former subjects of Europe's former overseas empires, who see Europe as a safe haven from the disruptions that were brought about by the end of a global system of empires. Here, the policies of European nations are uniformly to provide no safe landing, and indeed to sink those making crossings. So I'll finish up by saying that I think the sentiments of the book are admirable, and Europe, as Hans sets out, is a racialized project. But then so too is Britain. There's nothing specific to Brexit or unique to Britain that suggests that Britain will develop in a less Eurocentric direction. But if it does, it's much more likely to do so in the form of British nationalism, again, as set out by our Home Secretary just this afternoon. So I guess, given that I've mentioned the Home Secretary a couple of times, that would be one other question I would want to ask Hans. How does Eurowhiteness account for Suella Braverman? And if we're committed to the idea of cosmopolitanism, then in a way there's no more cosmopolitan cabinet than the current UK government. But that's not really a vision of cosmopolitanism that I guess many of us, or some of us at least, would subscribe to. And so if we were to take the colonial history seriously and think about the need for a decolonial project for Europe, that would enable us to cut through this idea of cosmopolitanism as diversity, which often skews the debate to allow the status quo to be reproduced, as opposed to thinking about something that could and possibly would be more transformative. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hans and Simon, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk about this book. I actually read an earlier draft of it, so it's great to actually see it out there. There's a great deal of which I agree with Hans in the book about. I think it's an absolutely fascinating book. It's written with very considerable clarity. And I think, although he's not the first person to make this argument, as Hans has already said himself in the Euro-Africa book, is he explains really sharply, clearly and succinctly why everybody who wants to talk about the European Union's history should acquaint themselves with the Algeria story, because it kind of blows up quite a lot of things, just understanding some basics about it. I think you said this at one point, Hans, like at the point of the Treaty of Rome, so 1957, there is more territory of the European Economic Community in Africa than there is in Europe. And once you kind of take that on board, then you can't quite think about any of this in the same way. So, I want to talk though. I want to wade back into like medieval and early modern history. I hope there's going to be a point to this in terms of the payoff. And this is partly because I think that I disagree with Hans a bit about this, but I think I disagree because I think in ways I think is consequential in terms of where we are now. So in Hans's story, the medieval construction of Europe as Christian Europe works with the other really primarily, forgive me if I'm getting you wrong here, of Islam. And it's a story at its centre which has Spain and the defeat of Islamic Spain in 1492, which obviously also happens to be the year of beginning of Spanish Empire effectively in the Americas with Colombia. Now, I think, though, that the story of how Europe is being defined at this point isn't necessarily actually about Christianity versus Islam. I think that's true about Spain, but I'm not, and maybe Portugal, but I'm not really sure that it works quite so effectively once we turn eastwards, and particularly if we put Austria or Holy Roman Empire with Vienna as its capital at the centre. I think it's at least as much and more powerfully in the end, actually, about Western Christianity versus Eastern Christianity, or put it differently, Catholicism versus Orthodoxy. And that's why I think that if you go back and look at this like early Austrian stuff, and I do really mean Austrian stuff this time, in the beginning of the 20th century after the First World War, that they're so keen on invoking like Charlemagne, Holy Roman Empire. You go and read someone like Stefan Zweig, and he writes about the Roman Empire as if it was entirely made up of what then become Catholic countries, and it has absolutely nothing, according to Stefan Zweig, to do with Byzantium. It's just like absolutely ahistorical, just like. But at the core of that, I think, is this idea that really defined what this Christian Europe meant as being Catholic Christianity. And I think then if you look at a few things, bits of history, this idea that actually medieval and early modern Europe defined itself against Islam and regarded Islam as the problem, or the other would be a better way of putting that, kind of runs into some difficulties, but that go all the way into the 20th century, I would suggest. So if you look at France, and this is where we begin here, is the French had an alliance with the Ottomans which began in 1536 and it lasted till 1798, until Napoleon went to try to conquer Egypt. At various points, the French are actually helping the Ottomans against the Holy Roman Empire, against Vienna, including when Vienna is under direct siege from the Ottomans, as late as in the 1680s. Now you get people saying, "What on earth are they doing? They're supposed to be on our Christian side." But this is a several centuries long alliance where there's no sense of actually there being Christian France on the side of Christian Austria against Muslim Ottomans. If we go on to the 20th century, we go to the First World War. We see now Germany under the Kaiser. He persuades the Ottomans to come into the First World War on the German side and to issue a jihad against the French and the British. So here, actually, we've got, again, any idea of like religious unity and some Christian Europe, not only fighting against each other, which is obviously what the First World War is, but the Germans, as I say, asking the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, to pronounce a jihad against the British and the French. Now, I think then this has like consequences if we think about the middle of the 20th century, or the years of European integration, and we think the first part I mean by that is the 1950s, and we ask ourselves a question: what was Algeria doing in? But we know what the answer to this is that it was part of France. Note it wasn't actually part of the coal and steel community, it's part of the Treaty of Rome. But Algeria is in, it doesn't get freedom of labour in the way, so that would sort of kind of say that there is a bit something racialised about that. But think about the country that's being left out of the Treaty of Rome. Obviously there's lots of European countries. Switzerland get left out of everything, we just ignore Switzerland. Generally they're like Northern European countries, plus Austria, which is neutral. But then there's another one that's not in Eastern Europe and which is Greece. Now Greece is like democratic then, kernels come later. It's not Spain and Portugal which aren't, it's in NATO. What it is orthodox. And I think that is an issue that is quite like revealing, and I think you can see it as in the Eurozone crisis. I've written some things about this. Some of the language that is used is like the Greeks are defined as being different. There's a bit between, I think it's between Giscard and a German I've forgotten, where they're basically discussing the Greece in 2010, and they say, well, they never really were Europeans, were they? We never should have let them in. And I think that is quite revealing. Now, I think if you go try and think a bit more about this, I think this does raise some questions, and in a way, it's what Gurminder's already said, is race quite doing all the work that you want it to do in the argument, Hans? Because I think it's different to say that the EU's own self-understanding and EU history has absolutely got to get to grips with the colonial history. I don't think there's a good disagree about that. But I'm not sure whether race can do everything that you want it to do, of like the fusion of things that you're putting together. And I think that if we take like Algeria, for instance, and then we ask that question about like, why is Algeria in and Greece out? And think about it in materialist terms rather than go back to a history of who's not European in this story. The answer would be because Algeria had oil discovered in 1956 and Greece didn't have any resources to offer. What's Congo got to offer? It's got uranium. So, and then obviously that goes to the question of like what these European powers are doing being colonial in Africa in the first place. And this I think is load bearing for now, because the question that's obviously getting raised again by the kind of economic relations that European Union as a whole and individual European countries at the top of the hierarchy of the European Union want with African countries is about resources again. It is about them having metals that European countries don't have for the energy transition. And this is a bit in the same vein, and I kind of reasonably clear what I think about that, which is that I think that you don't actually, there's something more going on than race here, and you've got to think about it in terms of like resources too. This one I'm not so sure about. I'm going to throw it out there as a final thought, as a question for you, Hans. This is like, well, why do you actually think that Macron went civilizational in 2019? Because your general thesis here in that chapter is like, as the problems of the neoliberal, to use that term, version of the EU came to the fore through the Eurozone, what came to substitute for it was civilizational. And I sort of half buy that. But if we get beyond the general to the specific, like what is going on with Macron in like 2019? Is it just that, you know, Merkel said no to him about Eurozone reform, he's not getting anywhere with like strategic autonomy, so he decides to go civilizational? Maybe. But I think it needs a little bit more like pushing at, because it goes hand in hand with that moment, which I actually was going to say something about this, and which actually does fit with something to do with Austria that I left out, which is, it goes hand in hand with when he wants to talk about resetting relations with Russia. And I do think this Russia question is quite central to a lot. So if you go back to, I meant to actually say this earlier, if you go back to this, who do the Austrians think of, when I'm saying Austrian, I'm meaning old Austria, who do the Austrians think of in the 18th and the 19th century as that Eastern other? It means Russia. Once that they've really defended Vienna for the last time against the Ottomans, who's the East? Who's the other? It's Russia. And what does Russia mean? It means the next version of orthodoxy after Byzantium. That is quite in there. So, in a sense, then, when Macron's wanting reset, he's messing around in those like waters. And it's interesting, I think, that if you go back and listen to some of the things that, or read some of the things that Macron was saying at that time, he seemed to be spending quite a bit of time reading Orban's speeches. And Orban absolutely goes into all these like historical waters. Now, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it's just worth thinking a little bit more about like where is that actually coming from with Macron. And the other possibility, which kind of works a bit in your terms, would be it's about domestic politics in France. But I think that it's such a turn from where he starts, he being Macron, that it's worth more thought.
Yeah.
Thanks. So thanks to Hans for writing this book, first of all, which is something I would strongly recommend you to read. I'm very sympathetic to the book. It's a great corrective to a certain unreflective pro-Europeanism. And from a critical angle, it opens up, for me, it opened up a new dimension in terms of thinking about a critique of the EU. What I want to try and do is get to the roots of the politics of Eurowhiteness and to try and dig a little under this surface discourse. And in that respect, Hans in the book provides some clues, but they're rather implicit, so I want to see if I can push you a bit there. So I'm going to say two things about what I think the book does very well. A third point that is interesting but ambiguous, and a fourth point that I want to see how far we can go. So the first thing that the book does very well, and it's already been described by Simon right at the start, is to expose this fallacy of Eurocentrism, to burst the bubble of the idea of Europe as a cosmopolitan entity, which is not just to believe that Europe is the centre of the world, but in some way to mistake Europe for the world. In a sophisticated version of that, the version that, for example, we get from Jürgen Habermas, we did get from Jürgen Habermas 20-odd years ago, is the idea that the European Union is the stepping stone to the construction of a world society. And there are a number of ways to expose this fallacy, from practical examples such as the way that as internal borders are removed, external ones are hardened, or, for example, the belief that the EU somehow weakens the coercive aspects of the state, whereas it often strengthens them. But I want to focus a little bit more on the flip side, the belief that Europe is the world, which is the belief that Europe is not the nation. And Hans, I think, here comes up with a useful term, which is the idea of regionalism, which suggests that far from being the antithesis of nationalism, Europe has emerged as a nationalism writ large. And I think we can, and Hans does suggest this, we can push this further and say that regionalism has all the worst aspects of nationalism: chauvinism, a belief in European superiority, a certain exclusivity, but none of the redemptive ones, the democratic politics, representative institutions, and a functioning public sphere. And it's important to note, as Hans does, and it's come up in the discussion, that the ethnic civilizational features of regionalism are advanced not only in the discourse of the far right, you can think Maloney, think Orban, but also of the centre, both at the supranational level, von der Leyen, Borrell, as well as domestic politicians such as Macron, who are intertwined in the two layers, so to speak. Now, Eurocentrism is not merely an ideology, and I want to quote here Samir Amin, who wrote what I think is the book on Eurocentrism back in the mid-1980s. Samir Amin was an Egyptian political economist. To quote, Eurocentrism is much more than a banal manifestation of European superiority. It implies a theory of world history and a global political project. In other words, these are not just words. And if we look then to the history of the concept of regionalism, the second point I want to say that Hans does very well in the book is to offer a historical reconstruction of European regionalism. Here he maps out the lineages of the idea of a European regional identity as revolving around the construction of whiteness, complexly intertwined with issues of religion, and I would add of myth itself. It's notable that Europe is a highly constructed concept. The idea of Europa itself, the term signifies a Phoenician princess abducted by Zeus in one of the origin myths of Europe. Europa itself is not European. It has this inside-outside feature. The civilizational discourse that Europe is entwined with is dynamic, and Hans also shows how it moves from the idea of Christendom to a racial discourse of white supremacy as a justification for imperial expansion and exploitation. And then into the 20th century, eugenics and fascism. And it was interesting, maybe surprising, that there isn't a full-blown discussion of fascism in a book called Eurowhiteness, although Hans does note that a feature of Eurocosmopolitanism is to present the Holocaust as an exceptional stain on Europe's otherwise untainted past, rather than a continuation of imperialism and colonialism, as, for example, Hannah Arendt argued. And so the crucial historical hinge, for me at least, and I think for Hans to some extent as well, is the interwar era, when Europe becomes not simply a discourse but a project, when the aristocrats of the pan-European movement saw Europe's individual nationalisms as an obstacle to European greatness, foreclosing Europe's destiny to rule the world. It is in that moment that Europe moves from ideology to becoming a political project, although it's only in the post-war period itself that it becomes a concrete project as we know it today, with European integration and European Union. And in the foundational stages, as we've heard this evening already, Hans notes the intertwinement of the origins of European integration with the story of decolonialization, the fact that European integration in the core is the reflex of decolonization in the periphery, an attempt to maintain global or at least regional influence through the Eurafrica project, substituting a competitive for a cooperative colonialism, and specifically consolidating French power in the core, as well acting as a bulwark to communism, which acts as an other in the Cold War in a way which we haven't really discussed, but I'll come back to towards the end. Now, in terms of the project of integration, geopolitics, real geopolitics gets in the way, in the sense that the aspirations for European greatness are dampened by superpower rivalry globally. And to some extent, the project of regionalism is concealed by a social market economy, which remains largely a national affair. And what is interesting here is that in this historical narrative that Hans tells in the book, regionalism returns after Maastricht, the end of history, and particularly through the Euro crisis phase, when Europe, Hans notes, becomes more white as neoliberalism prevails and the idea of a civic democracy recedes. A point also which Helen mentioned, and I think does provide some clues, which I'll come back to as well. So this is the point, then, the third point of ambiguity, which is what this label of whiteness or Euro-whiteness really does. The book itself is a book about Europe, and more specifically the European Union, and in a sense the slippage between those two things. The label whiteness is a modern notion, sometimes traced, as Hans notes in the book, to the attempt in pre-Civil War US to split the dominated classes, the indentured European from the African slaves. It was, in a sense, a tool of domination, a discourse to keep the dominated classes separate. In the many discussions of the book, no one really asked what whiteness actually means. And this is going to be my attempt to answer that question. I think it functions in the book as a sort of negative signifier. What it does, the discourse of whiteness, is to repress or deflect or displace another type of conflict, a conflict of class or a conflict of political economy, or simply a democratic conflict. In a certain terminology, we would say it's superstructural, which is not to say that it's unimportant. But the way Hans uses it is ambiguous. Now, the term Euro-whiteness comes from, as we've also heard already, this sociology of the Central European concept of a dirty white, a liminal zone of, to quote a recent author from Central and Eastern Europe, a place where people are white, but not quite. And this idea of the hierarchies within the EU gets to something of what this concept is doing. But that wasn't particularly developed in the book, along with the notion of the idea of semi-hegemony, German semi-hegemony, which Hans has worked on. So it surprised me a little that in the book there wasn't more about the various hierarchies among the member states of the European Union, or the internal colonialism, for example, that we might have witnessed between debtor and creditor countries in the Euro crisis. The puzzle then for what whiteness stands for, the clue to the answer to that question is in the bit of the book which deals, in a sense, not with whiteness but with neoliberalism, and how identity politics, including the discourse of whiteness, is a reflex of neoliberal depoliticization. In other words, the discourse of the ethno-cultural discourse of whiteness is the flip side to what Peter Meyer calls the void. And the void itself is a feature of the European Union's constitutional architecture, or rather we should say the constitutional architecture of the member states of the European Union. And I will here quote from the book. On page 8, Hans says, as economic policy has been depoliticized within the EU, political contestation has shifted to issues around identity, immigration, and Islam. So everything there is sort of wrapped up together. And as I put it in my review of his book, in the Jacobin piece, with citizens unable to change its basic economic orientation, the EU is ever more obsessed by identity. In other words, the key issues of political economy, as they are subsumed through the process of European integration, ethno-cultural themes start to dominate as a result. And Hans identifies this happening through the Euro crisis phase as a period in which this regional ethnic discourse of whiteness comes to dominate. Of course, it's in this period, too, that the democratic deficit turns, to quote Domenico Miani, into a democratic default. It is also the period, not coincidentally, in which international solidarity within Europe is eroded. Again, we can think of the relationship between Greece and Germany, which represents something bigger than just those two countries. And I think this is not accidental. And that brings me to the final point, or the point before the final point, which is the Brexit discussion. So the
You might have to make it your final point.
Is it my final? Okay, so I'm running out of time. Well, let me just say the Brexit functions in the final chapter of the book as a potential corrective. The chance for Britain, in a sense, to be less white really means, in this reading of the book, the chance for it to repoliticize social life around material issues. Of course, whether that happens or not is a whole other question, and that itself depends on politics. But to, in a sense, make my very final point, if we think about the discourse of neoliberalism and Eurowhiteness as having this longer trajectory together, that actually European integration right from the start is not only about regionalism but also about depoliticization, then we can say that what is required as the antidote to Eurowhiteness is two things. A more fully universalism, to quote Hans and Samir Amin, and there I think we have a ready-made term with which to substitute regionalism, and that would be internationalism. And second, a focus on repoliticization, and specifically a culture in which our differences can be debated and determined democratically. So I will conclude that both these things require an even deeper critique of the EU, but that Hans takes us quite far along that route. Thank you very much.
Well, just before we open it up for questions, I'm going to give Hans an opportunity to at least give some right of reply to the points that have been made to him. So, Hans.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you all. I'll be very brief. I mean, I thank you all for your comments, and I really like the way that each of you, from your different perspectives, kind of complicated my argument. And I think, I mean, I mostly agree with almost everything that each of you said. And I think there's a much longer version of this book which would have kind of got into some of these complexities. So very briefly, I mean, Helen, I think Helen and Mike, I think you're both right to say that I underplay some of the sort of internal tensions and hierarchies, to use your term, Mike, within Europe. On the particular point you made, Helen, about Islam as an other, I think you're absolutely right that there's a complicated story of multiple others. Throughout this history, and by the way, this also links to the Russia, which came up once or twice as well, which at various points has been an other for Europe as well, and I think is becoming one again now. But also in terms of the question around am I overplaying the role of Islam as another? I think you're right. There is a more complex story, Helen. I think most of what you're talking about, I think, comes a little bit later during the medieval period than I was thinking in particular. For example, the first time in which the term Europeans, people are referred to as Europeans, is in the Mozarabic Chronicle in 1732, and it's used. The context in which that word is used, Europenses, is specifically to contrast the Franks with the Arabs, right? And then to come to the present day, or the recent past rather, you do have these extraordinary moments, like for example in the debate about Turkish accession, when in 2004 Fritz Bolkestein, who at the time is a European Commissioner, says that if Turkey were to join the European Union, it would mean that the liberation of Vienna in 1683 would have been in vain, right? To show that regardless of what the actual history was, I do think there's a way in which even retrospectively, as it were, Islam becomes one of the central others. But I don't want to claim that it's the only other there's ever been for Europe. And then I guess the other thing I'll just say something about is, thank you, both of you again, Helen and Mike, for bringing in the sort of materialist kind of part of this story, which you're quite right, Mike, is sort of slightly buried in a way in the book. But the way you've described it, I think, is quite right. The story I really try to tell is around how, there was this earlier period in the European project where, as I mentioned in my remarks, there was this European identity which was centred on the social market economy and the welfare state and the kind of idea of solidarity that it was seen to embody. And so, for example, this phrase, the European way of life, was used at that time, in the sort of even up to the 2000s by, French socialists, but what Europe means and the European way of life is the social market economy and the welfare state. And then I think that gets hollowed out. And then, this void gets filled by culture and this idea of a sort of civilizational kind of identity for Europe. So I do, agree with you that what is driving this is actually some of these economic questions, and in particular, as you say, the depoliticization of economic policy within the European Union. And then, Helen, in terms of Macron, in a way, I just see the Macron turn as a sort of microcosm of what's happened, on a larger scale throughout Europe, which is precisely this story that as the project of a kind of Europe based on solidarity and economic solidarity gets hollowed out, that there's this turn towards culture, and it seems as if Macron is almost the last gasp of this kind of attempt by the French centre-left to create a more redistributive Europe, a social Europe, and then that fails, and then he turns to, and redefines his idea of l'Europe qui protège, a Europe that protects in terms of cultural protection rather than economic protection. I don't think I'm going to say anything more about Brexit. I go through moments of optimism about post-Brexit Britain and moments of pessimism where I share some of what you said, but I think Mike's explained very well how it could be an opportunity, but that needs to be, we need to fill that with political content.
Okay, great. Now we do, hands are going to go straight up because we do have some time for some questions and discussion from the audience. Is there a microphone moving around? Okay, so I'm going to take 3 off the bat, which go 1, 2, 3. And if you could keep them questions relatively short because we haven't got all day.
Hello, first of all, thank you so much to all the speakers for their valuable contributions. My question would be specifically about the concept of the dirty white and the kind of hierarchical positions in Europe between Eastern Europe specifically and the countries such as Germany and France. And I was wondering if your analysis about race, about kind of the colonial aspect of Europe, mainly seeking resources, having this civilization kind of tool or thinking about other countries or seeing certain countries as strategic opportunities, applies the same to the hierarchies within the European Union, or is something more specific about the hierarchies within Europe? And if that's the case, then how are you going to add that to the analysis of how the structural reason why Europe managed to kind of seclude this type of imperial history is through the external and internal narratives that they formed?
Brilliant, well done. Thank you very much. And really interesting question. We'll go straight on to, we'll take 3 and then you can come back. So second one there, and then we're down here.
Thank you so much. That was really brilliant. I wanted to come back to a question that Mike asked about what Eurowhiteness means or does, and related to the question of race in the subtitle of the book. So if we think about what the term blackness does, one critique that we often hear addressed against critical black studies is that blackness is often understood in 2 US-centric terms related to US and Caribbean histories of slavery, plantation logics, etc. And that blacks in Europe or in Asia would relate with difficulty to this understanding of blackness. So my question is, what did Eurowhiteness produce a particular understanding of Euro-blackness and understood here, blackness understood here not as basically a non-white normative subjectivity, on non-whiteness, let's say. And if so, how does that relate to other understandings of blackness in the US or elsewhere?
Thank you so much. I think we should just have questions of this quality for the next 20 minutes and give up on any arguments. Really interesting. The next one's here. You've got a lot to keep up with here.
Obviously, my question was not quite so good, but I remember when there was a campaign for Britain to join the common market as it was then, and one of the arguments was which you haven't mentioned, deserting our Commonwealth friends, which actually, in the questions of race, meant Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and not Africa and the Caribbean states in some minds. And I just wonder if you could comment on that, please.
Super. Have a go.
It's all for me.
I think, Hans, it's all for you just for the moment.
Okay. So look, they're all great questions, and I need a long time to answer each of them properly. Very quickly, on the sort of internal hierarchies. So I think the story of Central and Eastern Europe is quite complicated, but I sort of see roughly two sides to it. That on the one hand, there's clearly a way in which, to put it simply, Western Europeans look down on Central and Eastern Europeans. And I mentioned in my opening remarks that during the accession process, there's a way in which you can understand this as a kind of new civilizing mission, right? That the Central and Eastern Europeans needed to be civilized, and then they could join the European Union. And this is part of a longer history of a sort of Western European gaze, that goes back to the Enlightenment. There's a very good book by Larry Wolff called Inventing Eastern Europe, which describes this very well. But then there is this other side, and for me this is captured by this phrase, the return to Europe, that is always used to describe, from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europeans themselves, how they understood the accession process, right? They were returning to Europe. And it's really interesting when you think about it, because that phrase is used so often and sort of taken for granted that it was a return to Europe. People don't really interrogate what that phrase means, and I think it's really interesting when you start to think about it, because in what sense was it a return to Europe, right? If what we mean by Europe is just the post-war integration project that begins in 1945, then the Central and Eastern European countries weren't returning to it because they'd never been part of it. Right, so it has to be some older idea of Europe, and this is the longer history that I try to talk about in the book, and I think it's fairly clear that was at least in part an ethnic, cultural, civilizational idea of Europe that Central and Eastern European countries thought they were rejoining. That doesn't fully answer your question, I know, but that's all I think I have time to get into right now. Then on this really interesting question about race, and in particular sort of the US versus Europe. So I'm not sure that I can say much about blackness in Europe versus the United States, but one of the things I was trying to do in the book, and in a way this goes to something that Gurminder said as well, which is I think there is a tendency sometimes to think that that whiteness makes sense in an American context but not in a European context, right? That we understand that Europe has a colonial kind of history and that we need to engage with that, but this language of colour is an import from America that doesn't quite work in Europe, and I think this is wrong. And I think this is actually one of the blind spots. It's, by the way, part of the reason I wanted to have this particular title. We now have a lot of studies of whiteness, in the last decade or so, but nearly all of them focus entirely on the American experience. And as I say, I think that slightly feeds this idea that it's not a relevant category in the European context. I think it absolutely is, and in a way, the gap that I think we need to try to fill, and my book is a very, very small piece of that, is to start to think about European histories of whiteness, how the concept of whiteness has functioned in a European context. And just to give you one example that shows this is absolutely a relevant category in the European context. If you think about, say, the Code Noir, which was the French edict that governed slavery in French colonies, uses that exact same language of colour. So I think the American story and the European story are actually much more similar than a lot of people want to believe. And then finally, on the Commonwealth, So I think I'm not entirely convinced that that is true, that when, for example, the debate during the 1975 referendum, when Barbara Castle, for example, was talking in exactly the terms that you were hinting at, that this is a sort of betrayal of the Commonwealth, she was absolutely talking about the non-white Commonwealth as well as the white Commonwealth. At that time, and it's interesting from today's perspective because it feels very different now, but at that time, it was mainly the left that really liked the idea of the Commonwealth in the 1970s, and they were absolutely talking about the non-white Commonwealth as well.
That's an interesting point, because earlier when Churchill said that Britain shouldn't join, he also appealed to the Commonwealth, but his appeal, it seems to me, was to the white Commonwealth. And then when India, in fact, became a part of the group of countries destined for independence, Churchill sort of lost so much interest in there being this other unity alongside a European one that Britain would be central to. And at that point, Churchill starts moving towards being pro-European for Britain.
Maybe I can just add the quote from Barbara Castle, the famous quote in the debate in the Oxford Union in 1975. She says, "What kind of internationalism," to come back to your term, Michael, "what kind of internationalism is it that says henceforth this country must give priority to a Frenchman over an Indian, a German over an Australian, an Italian over a Malaysian?"
Right. Good. Okay. Yeah, and I guess that's the hope at the end of your book as well, is that something of that spirit could be rekindled. Now, we've got time for doing this all over again. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. So, 1 there. No. Well, yes, obviously can hear you because I said I could.
Reparations? Yeah, great.
Okay, lovely. And now at the back, the man sitting behind the Mac.
Hi, it's on the hope. One of the best things about the book, I mean, there's lots of good things about the book, but the most interesting thing about the book is your account of British migration policy, I think, and because that was new to me. I mean, it was, as soon as you look at it, you think, God, that's true, but I hadn't thought of it like that. That as Britain became more and more interested in European integration, it became more and more closed to Commonwealth migration. So as it becomes easier for Europeans to move to Britain, it becomes harder for people from South Asia or from the Caribbean to come to Britain. And that's directly experienced in the lives of Britain's immigrant population. I thought that's a really interesting connection. And so now that we've left, then the question is, does it reverse? And it seems to me that, my question is, has it? Not will it, but has it? Because we can, whatever we think about Suella Braverman, and her particular politics on migration, she's exercised about unlawful unauthorised migration into Britain, but her government presides over unprecedented levels of immigration, even post-EU period, predominantly from the non-white Commonwealth. And so my question is, isn't this just at the material level, the level that Mike's particularly interested in, at the political level, it could be this, it could be that, but at the material level, it's just happening. That reorientation back and that ending of the Eurocentrism in domestic life is just a process happening.
Thank you so much. And we have a third there. Yeah.
Thank you. I've kind of got 2 questions, but the first one's very quick. And
Let's just have that one then.
It kind of picks up on the point about European refugee policy, and I just wondered whether the refugee policy towards the Ukraine war features at all in the book.
Yeah.
Because certainly in the British context, it seemed like a very racialised policy of preference towards white Europeans over, for example, Syrians or other refugees.
Although we didn't really let in anybody. equality there. But you're right. Okay, so there's the three. Do you want to take any of them? I like the one that
Reparations.
on reparations.
Because you've written about this.
I mean, in the context of, I mean, where to start though on that?
Yeah.
Because I mean, in a way, and I guess picking up on the question of blackness as well, one of the ways in which debates in the UK get framed, and I think the use of the language of blackness precisely points to an American orientation to these debates, because if Britain is anything, it's not just black and white. There's a history of migration to Britain from both Africa and Asia more broadly, and the colonial histories that locate Britain in the context of its relations to both Asia and Africa and make its extractive policies so immense that reparations wouldn't just be to African countries, it would be to Asian countries, and it would be also to a rethinking of the very structures of global inequality that European colonialism has established. And if we think about that in the context of climate change, which is perhaps one of the most visible ways in which that global inequality is being manifest, to the extent that the people who contributed the most to climate change are the ones who suffer the least from its effects, whereas those who've contributed the absolute least suffer the most. That reparations, for me, wouldn't be something that was done in a one-to-one relationship, but rather to think about how do we create a world that works for all of us. And addressing the climate crisis would be one way of doing that. So it sort of takes away from what we're focusing on in terms of Hans's book, but that would be my entry point into the debate on reparations.
Fascinating there, it links up with something that came in at the end of Mike's talk, which is that there's still in this conversation a desire to move towards, or striving towards making a contribution to human universality, or to universality generally, which in some paradoxical way, the European discourse of cosmopolitanism at least opened up that possibility. And I think a huge question for me in the book is whether we can think of cosmopolitanism simply as this European myth, exclusively as that. Regionalism, European regionalism certainly is not conceived as an end until you cut off Kant's last sentence. And then it is. European regionalism can be a done deal, an attained moment. But insofar as inside Europe, inside European politics and society, there is this aspiration to make a contribution to universality, that seems to be not over. Whether Europe itself can make a contribution to that, I don't know. Anyway.
Could I just add, I mean, do you think it can make a material contribution? Because there's no point to having a commitment to universality, and that material contribution would be to recognise that the very conditions of our existence within Europe have been funded through the extraction of colonial wealth. So are we going to give the money back as a material embodiment of universality?
I'm not going to speak
Otherwise,
for anybody on
what does
that.
it mean?
Well, so, and I'll add just two quick things to that, which is that, you know, my sense is that, you know, there's just the beginning of this debate about reparations in Western European countries that had overseas colonies. But even there and here, you know, I have in mind, Gurminder, you know, the way you open your paper on a decolonial Europe, where you contrast the way that, you know, Germany paid reparations to the State of Israel and to the Jewish community for the Holocaust in 1954 Luxembourg Agreement, but yet, you know, it's only really been in the last couple of years that there's a discussion even about reparations for Namibia, where Germany carried out the first genocide of the 20th century. And even that is framed not in terms of reparations, but in terms of basically aid, development aid, right? Which I think shows the kind of contrast. But, you know, as kind of embryonic as that debate is in Western European countries, I think the reason I'm really quite pessimistic that there'll be much progress on this is I think Central and Eastern European countries, I think, are even less willing to think about some kind of collective European responsibility for European colonialism, because they say, well, we weren't colonising powers ourselves, we were the victims of imperialism ourselves.
Last word on the great question about...
Yeah, so Peter, thank you so much for really summarising my argument in the last part of the book, and really that was, you know, when I was saying earlier, Gurminder, about my more optimistic moments, it was channeling that. This is very personal for me, right? Because my father was Indian, my mother is Dutch. And they both came to Britain in the 1960s at a time when actually it was much easier for somebody like my father to come to Britain than someone like my mother. And actually, you know, my father was much more of an insider in British society as an Indian man than my mother was as a Dutch woman. And in the course of my lifetime, that's been reversed, that position, where it's become harder and harder for people from Britain's former colonies to come to Britain, and much easier for people from Europe to come to Britain. And I think you're absolutely right, Peter. The statistics show, to answer your question, Simon, you know, apparently, you know, not necessarily out of an intention by this current government, this is now being partially reversed. You know, the extraordinary rise of non-EU immigration since Brexit, in particular from India and Nigeria, you know, it's quite extraordinary, you know, so it does seem like that is happening. I would like to go even further. That's the argument I make at the end of the book, but I think to some extent it's already happening. And then very final quick word on the racialisation of refugees. I think that's absolutely right, but I think I would say that it's even more racialised in continental Europe than it is in Britain.
I think that was what my facetious point was making. But he's lost you. You've lost him to his phone. It's always a risk. As it is, we've come to an end. You may have left us already, but we're going to leave together. So it only remains to thank our panellists for a wonderful discussion.